thank you so much, one, for having me, and two, just for coming and listening to me and hearing me out. How did we get here? How did we get here? I can't tell you how many times I ask myself that question. You know, I ask it about the state of our society, the education system, about my own generation, and sometimes also about myself. How did I get here? How did I get here standing in front of all of you guys today? And what makes me so interesting that you all want to listen? How did you guys get here? Maybe you also ask yourself the same question about society, about our culture, education, and kids these days. And you see the trajectory that the nation's on, and it scares you. It disgusts you, it saddens you. Transgenderism has taken over society. Left and right, you're told that men can become women, and vice versa. And you know you're not crazy, but sometimes it feels like you are because you're the odd one out saying, no, I still believe that there's a difference between men and women. And that's when you ask yourself, how did we get here? Well, as you guys know, I'm Katie, and I have first-hand experience with the transgender issue. So I'm what's known as a female to male to female detransition, which means that I'm biologically female, but for a period of time I identified myself as a male and took steps to make myself appear more masculine. That's called transitioning. So I transitioned myself socially and medically from female to male, and recently I completely stopped the process and I started detransitioning, or going back to living as my biological sex, but of course my body's permanently damaged from the experience. So I actually didn't start identifying myself as transgender until I was 18, but I came to the conclusion that I was transgender by looking back at my childhood. So when I look back, I saw, I'd always been a tomboy. I always preferred boys' toys and clothing and games over any of the girl stuff. And if my parents wanted me to wear the girls' clothing, I would fight them on it and say, no, I'm not going to wear the girls' clothing. But I never thought that I was a boy. I knew that I was a girl and that I had certain preferences. At most, I would think, yeah, I'm a girl, but boys are better than girls. And that's something that I actually did think. So growing up, I really thought that boys were better than girls. And I think now that it's because I was very into sports and video games. And when it comes to sports, the boys just always beat the girls. That's just how it happens. So I thought, well, if they're better than me at sports, at the thing that I love, it must mean that they're just better than me in general. And so you can see that as a middle school, things started to change a little bit. I was going through puberty, so things were about as awkward as they could be. Everybody remembers middle school. It's not ever going to be more awkward than that. But I did start letting my hair grow back out when I was very young. I like to have a short haircut just below my ears. And I started letting it grow by the time I got to middle school, and I was becoming more comfortable in my feminine identity and understanding that I'm growing into a woman and I do want to be respected as a woman. But I was just still so awkward that I didn't really know how to walk that fine line between being a respectable woman, but also wanting to play around in the dirt with all of the boys. But I think that type of confusion was just normal. It didn't make me trans, and nobody in my life told me, oh, you must actually be a boy. Nobody really believed that I was a boy, and I certainly didn't believe that at the time. It was in high school that things really started to get confusing because everybody around me in high school, it seemed like they were identifying somewhere on the LGBT acronym. And there weren't pride flags hanging in every classroom, but there were those yellow and blue equal rights stickers. And so I saw the LGBT lifestyles as equal and just as healthy as any other type of lifestyle. And so when I started to question my own self, I thought maybe I should find my place on the LGBT acronym, and that's what will work best for me. Now that started because I had my first boyfriend when I was about 15, and at 15 years old, I was still just as awkward as I was all of middle school. And I could not picture myself ever being in a sexual relationship with a boy. But all of my friends, when they got their first boyfriends, they went on birth control immediately, and that told me that the only relationship I could have with a boy is a sexual relationship. And that's just how I understood it. Obviously that wasn't the case, but at 15, that's what I thought all of that meant. And so I went to some of the older girls at school and I said, I don't think that I'm interested in boys enough. do you think I'm a lesbian? And luckily, the older girls at school, so they were maybe 16 or 17, they had a test to determine if you're a lesbian. And it was just one question, easiest test I ever took, and they asked me, can you picture yourself having sex with one of the boys? And I looked around the room and I said, nope, can't do that, can't picture that. And that made me an official lesbian. So at 15, maybe almost 16 at that point, I found a place in the LGBT acronym, and from there, my entire identity was built on the LGBT acronym. But once I got my lesbian identity, I was like, okay, maybe this works, but I still felt really awkward holding hands with girls in public because I knew the norm is man and woman. It's not woman and woman or man and man, it's just man and woman, that's the norm. And so it made me feel more uncomfortable about myself, I think. And what I started doing was I would look online and I would say, I'm really uncomfortable with myself, with my body, with my femininity. And I came across these videos of other teenage girls. I was about 17 at this point, maybe 18. And I came across these videos of other teenage girls talking about how they were also extremely uncomfortable in their bodies and what made them happy. And from the videos, it looked like they were extremely happy. What made them happy was transitioning to male, changing their name, asking people to use different pronouns, and then eventually going through the medical transition. So I thought, that must be me. I also grew up as a tomboy, just like all of these girls I'm seeing on social media. I want to be as happy as they are, so I should start transitioning. So when I was 18, I asked everybody in my life to call me by a boy's name and use male pronouns to refer to me. So in other words, I went through a social transition. Right after the social transition, I went to, I think, my last appointment with my pediatrician, because I was 18 at that point, and I told her, I'm transgender and I want to transition medically. And so she, no questions asked, she just referred me to a gender clinic in Boston. And when I went to them, I expected that they were gonna tell me, you need a therapist before we can start you on anything, because that was required in Massachusetts. But instead, when I went into the gender clinic, they were able to set me up with one of their in-office clinicians, and she signed off on medical intervention without me ever needing to see a therapist. It was just a 45-minute appointment. And so by the time I was 19, I actually held off the process until after finals that year, but if I hadn't, I would have started earlier. So by the time I was 19, I started taking testosterone in the form of weekly self-injections. Again, no therapist's approval on this. And it wasn't like you can start taking the testosterone but go see a therapist. I just didn't have one and they didn't care if I had one. I was starting on testosterone and I was paying for the testosterone, so I think that was a big part of it.
Yeah.
And for a while, the effects of testosterone felt really good. So my voice started to deepen. That was one of the first effects that I noticed. And I grew a little bit of facial hair, and overall, I think I started to look more masculine because just walking around every day, people would call me he without me having to tell them. It was just, if I walked by a stranger, they would assume that I was male. And that felt really good. But after about a year, so when I was 20 years old, that sense of euphoria from the testosterone started wearing off. And so I thought, well, my next step is gonna be top surgery. And I was watching the videos online of girls who had had top surgery, which is a double mastectomy to remove your breasts, just like the kind that breast cancer patients will get. So I'm watching these videos, and it's common for the girls to do a chest reveal video where they have their surgery and they're all bandaged up, and then the day that they're finally able to take their bandages off, they'll record themselves taking their bandages off in the mirror, and they'll record their reaction. And their reaction, to me, it just looked like there's no way for me to be that happy without doing this. Because when they were looking in the mirror, they would start crying, they would break down, tears of joy. They were just so, I thought they were just so happy about this and that they finally found joy in their identities. And so I thought, yeah, I need to go through with this top surgery. It's gonna make me feel so much better. And that actually is how I felt after I had the surgery. I had the surgery when I was 20 years old, removed my breasts, had the double mastectomy, and the recovery wasn't too bad. But I did start to feel really happy. I stood with my shoulders back, stood up really straight, and I had a lot of confidence. But after about 4 years, of just feeling very satisfied with myself, I started to have some serious abdominal pain. And I went to the gender clinic and I asked them, what is this abdominal pain? I've never had this before. Do you know what it is? And they said, yeah, that's just your uterus. After you take testosterone for a long period of time, you need a hysterectomy. It's what we do for all of our patients. And I did know from watching YouTube videos that there was a chance I was going to need a hysterectomy, a good chance I was going to need a hysterectomy down the road. I didn't expect it to come so soon. But the doctor said they'll have no problem scheduling me for the hysterectomy, and so they did. And in the summer of 2020, when everything else was shut down, I was at the hospital having a gender-affirming hysterectomy, and during the process, they removed my uterus, cervix, fallopian tubes, and both ovaries at the age of 24. Now, during that surgery, somehow one of my arteries was left open, and nobody noticed. But in recovery, I was getting worse and worse, and they were supposed to send me home that day. I wasn't supposed to stay at the hospital. They just took my organs and were going to send me home, but they noticed that I wasn't in good enough shape to actually go home. And so they admitted me to the hospital. They decided they would keep me overnight to monitor my recovery. And later on that day, I was in so much pain. I was just, rolling back and forth on the hospital bed, and I was getting physically sick. I was actually throwing up because of all the pain I was in. Well, I don't actually know if I was throwing up from the pain or from all the pain meds that they were putting in the IV, but I do remember telling them, I'm in too much pain. I can't handle this. I need you to give me something for it. And they said, we can't. We've already given you too much. So it was just immense pain. And then I started losing consciousness after a while. And of course, I didn't know why I was losing consciousness. They were taking my blood pressure and my pulse, and my blood pressure was dropping, my pulse was increasing, and they realized that I'd been bleeding out. So drifting in and out of consciousness, they were doing the ultrasound to see what was going on, and they saw all of the blood pooling in my abdomen. And so they rushed me back for emergency surgery. And I don't know exactly how many hours I had been bleeding out for. Quite a few, because my surgery was early in the morning, and they actually had to call the doctor from home to come back to the hospital to do the surgery that night. And so during the second surgery, the emergency surgery, he was able to fix his mistake, and I had 3 blood transfusions and made a full recovery after that. But if they didn't find that in time, if they didn't keep me overnight, if they weren't as vigilant as they were, I definitely would have died. I was already losing consciousness. My organs would have just started shutting down not soon after that. And people do die from these procedures. When you go in for surgery, anybody who has before, you know that they'll tell you there's always a risk of death. Sometimes the risk is very low, but the risk of any surgery is death. The doctors are cutting us open, and we're just trusting that they can put us back together. Now, I learned the hard way, if a doctor's cutting you open in a vain attempt to change your sex, probably don't trust that he can put you back together after. But anyway, about 6 months after my hysterectomy is when I started to fully regret my transition. And it happened slowly, but then one day it just all came crashing down on me. And it wasn't because of that experience in the hysterectomy. So even though I had that experience, and I have a lot of guilt from it because I'll think about what my parents were going through in those moments when they knew I was bleeding out and I was rushed back in for emergency surgery, having blood transfusions, that's where I have the most guilt. That's actually not the turning point for me. So the turning point for me was just a normal haircut appointment. I went to my barber just to get a regular haircut. I've been getting the same haircut for years, and I went to a talented barber. And so she cut my hair, and it was perfect. I was totally satisfied, gave her a tip, went back home, was gonna take a shower and clean all the hairs off the back of my neck. But when I got home and I looked in the mirror, I could only see myself as female. Wow. So here I am, years later, testosterone surgeries, everything. I look like a male at this point. People would pass me on the sidewalk, they would never think that I was a female. And actually at work, or with my friends, I would come out to them, and I would say, I'm actually transgender. I'm actually a girl. And they would say, yeah, like, what's the punchline? Well, come on, what's the joke? And they would actually think that I was a kid. They wouldn't actually think that I was biologically female. But here I am looking in the mirror, only seeing myself the way that I would have looked 7 years prior. So it was a really powerful experience, and I just couldn't stop looking at myself. I thought I was going crazy. Went ahead, I took a shower, I'm looking in the mirror, same thing. And I just couldn't get over it. And looking in the mirror, seeing myself as female, finally, for the first time in years, I really just felt so stupid, because here I am, with 7 years of permanent and unwanted changes to myself. I've been taking testosterone for 7 years at that point, 6, 7 years. I had the double mastectomy. I had the full hysterectomy. I don't even have ovaries anymore. And on top of it all, I had a men's haircut. And I just thought I looked absolutely ridiculous. And so when I reached that point, I really didn't know where to turn. Everything that I'd learned since high school taught me that transgenderism was good and regret doesn't exist. And even when I was transitioning, I didn't want to listen to anybody who said that they had detransitioned. I thought regret doesn't exist, that's never going to be me. I'm never going to be one of those detransitioners, so I don't even have to listen to them. But regret does exist. And in that moment, I felt it. And I started praying daily. I didn't know what else to do, so I started praying. But I was so depressed at that point that I started praying that I would die. That God would just end my life right there. I thought that I'd rather be dead than live as a detransitioner. And so, with nothing else left to lose, I thought I'd give church another try. So initially, I went to a Catholic priest and I did a confession with him. And later I settled on a different church closer to my work. And I sat down with my pastor one day, and I may have caught him off guard because we're just talking, and then I said, yep, so I'm transgender, and I don't think I want to be anymore. And I think he fully believed that I was just a young boy or a young man sitting in his office. We were just talking about whatever, and then I hit him with the, I'm actually a girl, and I want to go back to being a girl. And so he encouraged me to go back to using my birth name. He didn't force anything on me, but he did encourage me to take those steps that I thought I could never take alone. So I did go back to using my birth name, but only at church. And I told him, I'll do it just at church. I don't want to do it anywhere else yet. I'm not ready. And he said that was fine. And from there, I did start telling people, I want you to call me Katie again. I want to go back to using the name Katie, my birth name, that I actually got from my great-grandmother. And everybody did. And from that point, I started wearing more women's clothing. I started by wearing sort of a unisex look, I guess you could say, an androgynous look. And then I just worked my way to, yep, I'm just going to wear women's clothing and I'm totally comfortable with it and there's no issue whatsoever. But sometimes it still is uncomfortable. You know, some days I really just don't want to be a woman anymore. I'm like, I want to go back to being transgender. It was so much easier that way. And living as a boy, I just felt like I could be invisible. I could just fly under the radar. And now I feel like that's not really the case for me anymore. So the detransition was hard and uncomfortable, and it still is. You know, I'm always going to bear the scars of gender transition. Those are not going to heal until the last day, of course. So how did we get here? And I think we got here by treating doctors like high priests in the medical industry like a church. You know, we gave doctors the right to carve people up to try to make them look like the opposite sex, but we're not even honest enough to say that. You know, instead we'll say, or we'll fight about how old you have to be to have the right to be carved up. That's not a right. That's abuse. I came out of transgenderism broken and humiliated, and of course abused. There's no other way to come out of it. The only compassionate response to the issue is a loving no. You can't change your sex, and the doctors can't carve you up to try. The proper response to someone who's confused and ashamed about their biological sex is to assure him that there's nothing wrong with him. And there is nothing wrong with the trans-identified people. There was nothing wrong with me. My femininity wasn't a disease to be cured. What I needed to hear was the truth. And I think that's something that everybody can unite behind and just be able to speak the truth in love. And thank you everybody for coming tonight. I would like to open it up for questions and discussions and everything.